So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to the faction showcases that I'm going to be doing, and as promised we're going to be moving on to one of the ones that I've technically done already but we're going to be doing in this shorter format, and that is the Kingdom of RHUN. I've pushed Imladris back based on Kuro telling me that they're going to receive a couple of changes which are worth waiting for, and you know, I've also bumped things up to huge settings just so we can see the units in their full glory, so that's really it's not really too significant because obviously they will change relative to one another, and the increased numbers of the lower tier units will still be present and the ratios will still be largely the same. But still, RHUN, we should be moving on, and obviously it's still going to be the same thing, so the lower tier units are going to be here at the front, and as we move back we go into the higher and higher tiers. First of all, though, we will have a quick look at the artillery because it's nothing too special for RHUN. They have a basic ballista and a basic catapult which cost the same as any other, so if you look at the ballista here you can see that it costs 800, just a standard fare. And then the catapult over here costs 1,000, so nothing too impressive about the runic artillery lines. Just going to get those out of the way quickly, but now we shall move on to the runic infantry line, which they don't rely on quite so much as the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, but it is nonetheless quite a significant part of what they are all about. And we will start off with their most basic unit, the clansmen, and obviously they are a militia unit. They are the militia for RHUN, but they are one of, if not the best militia unit in the game when it comes to an all-around performer and the amount of cost effectiveness you can get out of them for a relatively small outlay. They only cost 400 and they've got decent stats, and they have a lot of men in the unit. They have 204, although it is worth saying as well that the basic Corsair units, the Corsair warriors as they used to be called, or Corsair soldiers as they might be called now, cost a similar amount, so that's another unit that you can look at them as a bit of a comparison, especially seeing as they're both evil men factions which do share several traits, and a bit of sort of the orcs have rubbed off on them a little bit in terms of how they do things with regards to their numbers policy. But also the Eastron clansmen do have something else to them which is worth remarking upon, which is they are the only militia unit in the game, I think, to have 2 levels of armour upgrade. So here we see the bronze level of upgrade where they gain an Easterling style helmet and some chest armour, and then we also move on to the silver level of upgrade, which of course gives them the old runic Swiftblades armour model. And this alone should tell you that the clansmen can be quite a potent tool to use on the field, because especially if you give them the silver armour upgrade model, that's going to upgrade their armour pretty substantially, and that makes them much harder to cut their way through, and they don't go down easily either. Now this unit model may give off the false impression that they can mix it with some of the sort of basic mainline infantry units from other factions, and with their superior numbers, if you get a favourable engagement they might, but in a straight 1-to-1 on a flat engagement where you can't wrap around the enemy, they will still lose. But against spear units of significantly higher cost, they may well emerge victorious, and that means they sort of escape the role of a militia being a purely meat shield only unit. Now, however, we move on to the other sort of lower tier unit. You pay 50 more for the privilege of having the Eastron warriors in your army, and essentially what you get for this is a lower defensive values overall. They do have more defensive skill, so they will actually last longer in a purely melee engagement, and they will also dish out more damage. However, you do suffer from this in terms of their ability to resist ranged attacks. Obviously their lack of a shield impacts their ability to survive under sustained archer fire pretty immensely, and it's for that reason that I don't think the Eastron warriors get used quite so much, because with your cheap units what you want is a good cost efficiency ratio, and that often means they're going to be sent in to the meat grinder and they're going to have to just survive as long as they can under pretty bad conditions, and the Eastron warriors do fall down in this regard. But if you're up against a force which you think is not going to bring a great deal of archers, so if you think Angmar are going to go full rush for example, you might want to bring the Eastron warriors, because they are they are an improvement in melee over the Eastron clansmen. Moving back, however, into the slightly higher tier, we have sort of in the middle here the Eastron Guard, which are a 2-handed spear unit as of now, at least that's what I was told. So they're no longer technically a halberdier, which means they don't have the armour piercing they once did. They've always been a bit of a glass cannon for RHUN for the most part, but having said that, I do still think they have a genuine place in the runic line. You know, they add to this versatility, this jack of all trades sort of label that's been given to RHUN several times in the past. And the fact that they've got a bonus fighting cavalry means they're pretty good at defending your back lines. If they get targeted by archers, they will fall apart in the same way that the Eastron warriors will. But that bonus against cavalry is a very good selling point, because it means that your back lines maybe won't be quite so vulnerable to cavalry attack. And also 550 isn't all that much in the grand scheme of things. Dwarves pay more for some of their lower tier units, so it does make some sense to bring the Eastern Guards in certain situations. If you think you're going to come up against a skirmish heavy army, though, they are better off left at home. But it is another option that RHUN have, which some factions would have to do almost entirely without sort of this extra utility of a pure spear unit, which they can just have in the background. Then we move on, however, to the heart and soul of the runic army in many ways, the Golden Boys, as we move on. And they have a halberdier, as I move backwards and forwards, they have a halberdier, a line infantry, and a spearman. Starting off with the halberdier, we have the Loke Gamprim, or Loka Gamprim. And one of the things to note about these is they do have a slight shield value because they have those shields on the back. Halberdiers will be outranged by pikes, and RHUN do lack pikes entirely, which is one of the few places in which their army does have a noticeable gap. Having said that, the Loke Gamprim's armour piercing really adds to the runic army's central punch. Their army can be very difficult to break down, particularly if you're a faction which relies heavily on armour, because RHUN's armour piercing, both in melee and at range, can be a really good weapon they can use, and the Gamprim can be a really big part of that, because they help hold down the front line, make it very difficult to chew your way through, because even if you have the ability to get through the Gamprim, chances are they're going to slow you down pretty substantially. Halberdiers, while they can't outrange pikes, they can outrange everything else, which slows down an infantry advance pretty substantially. However, when most people think of the runic infantry line, it's probably these guys which strike most fear into people, and that is the Loka Flagrim. This is the mainline infantry unit that RHUN have available to them. Now, they can't field them in quite the same numbers as something like the Gondor infantry, which you can bring 6 of, I'm still pretty sure. The Flagrim you have to field in significantly less numbers, which of course lends to the fact that the clansmen are going to be utilised by RHUN a little bit more, so you're going to have to rely on numbers to a certain extent. But the quality core of your army on foot and in melee, the Flagrim do a fantastic job against a lot of factions, mainly attributed to their armour piercing. They've got good defensive values as well, defensive of 21. They've got good armour as well. 10 armour is nothing to be sniffed at. That's higher than a lot of other standard infantry units. You do pay more for this though. 700 is not a small amount, and you can only have 3 before the cost increases, so you can't base an army around them exclusively like you can with some of the other kingdoms of men. And also there are pitfalls to this, remember. Their attack values are relatively low at only 6, so if you're up against a faction which isn't quite so reliant on their armour, something along the lines of the elves in particular, for example, the Flagrim aren't quite as good, and they will be much less cost effective than a basic unit of, say, Minisgirithlan swordsmen from another kingdom of men. But having said that, this is still one of RHUN's real selling points when it comes to their infantry force. And then finally we have the Spearmen, which interestingly enough is actually the most expensive part of this sort of central tribunal of their infantry. And the Loka Scion Rim are definitely the most defensive minded in terms of their individual survivability. A total defensive value of 22 is, and obviously they've got another armour point on top of that, so 11. They've also got a very big shield value of 8 as well. There are obviously units that are bigger, but this is still a very substantial one. Definitely they're a very hard nut to crack. Obviously they have that bonus fighting cavalry. Interesting note, they are certainly going to be utilised very well in sieges because they can make shield wall like all spearmen units can. But for the most part, I think they're probably going to be the least popular of these 3 main units for RHUN, in a field battle anyway, simply because of their cost. 800 is not a small amount of money to pay, and also I feel as though people will want to utilise some of RHUN's other toys. But having said that, I do like the Scion Rim. They are very difficult to break down, and if you want to play more defensive with RHUN, they're almost a must-have, because you can't get through them very quickly unless you have a very strong armour-piercing unit indeed. And then we move on to the units just back here, which I think actually these Carmel Shadow Guard are cheaper than the Scion Rim, indeed they are, but I put them back here just because they are not part of the main line of infantry. And this is the only unit that can hide anywhere of RHUN's infantry force, and they are effective against armour. They are the one shock troop, interestingly enough, that RHUN can field in terms of their melee infantry at any rate, and obviously this means they have a significantly high attack at 15. They're effective against armour. Of course they do pay for this in other ways. They don't have a shield at all, so they can be sprayed down by arrows at range, and their armour values of 7 won't do all that much to mitigate that. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not fantastic either. They do frighten nearby enemy infantry as well. Causing fear amongst the enemy ranks can be particularly effective against low morale factions like the Orcs of the Misty Mountains or Cardland, for example. And also, just the ability, a well-planned ambush can pay off, but of course it can blow up in your face as well, so do take care. And actually I was lying, this is another unit which can hide anywhere, the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. But this is technically not a pure melee infantry unit, because they do also have a missile attack. I believe they still have their Nafatoon style sort of explosive projectiles. Obviously it's like a little fire effect which sizzles individual unit models. and they are one of the assassin units in the game, which means they have a huge defensive skill, which means in melee they can mix it with even the best of the elves, the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, to be honest with you. A total defense of 27 means they're a nightmare to fight in melee for units of low skill. Chanting inspires nearby troops as well, so they can inspire the troops around them, which could be particularly useful when it comes to keeping those lower tier units at the front, the clansmen, in the fight. They frighten nearby enemy infantry as well. Effective against armour, I think, is only applicable to their missiles, though, because they are, of course, those Nafatoon fire-style explosives, so it doesn't really matter if you're wearing armour when you're sizzled alive inside it. Obviously, they have very good stats all around, but they do have a pretty low amount of units. I mean, this is on huge, remember, and there are only 73 of them, which is only a few more units than you would expect to see in a multiple HP unit, and they only have 1 HP. They're also 900, so they are pretty expensive. But again, a well-planned ambush can either win you the game, or it could cost you the game, and the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen are pretty much the ultimate embodiment of that. Potentially could be useful in a defensive siege as well, if used creatively. And then finally back here, of course, we have the one uber tier unit that RHUN have in terms of their infantry, and that is the Carmel's Chosen, a multiple HP sword and board unit. Obviously the 2 hit points is very significant. They can do skill trom as well, which most generals bodyguards can, so they can sort of turtle up and defend the general as best they can, but obviously skill trom that's a pretty desperate move if you're trying to use skill trom, particularly in an open field. But I do think that the Carmel's Chosen are probably only going to be seen in siege battles for the most part, because they are a pretty risky pick to bring on an open field. Not that it couldn't be done, of course, particularly on certain maps that are a little bit more choke pointy, for example, where you'll be glad to have them in that sort of situation because they don't go down easily and they can really help carry the day against this pretty solid enemy infantry line. They're not armor piercing like they were in the old days, but then everything has been scaled back down a little bit. But there's really not much to say about them other than that. I mean, a total defense of 33 is very high, and yeah, multiple HP, very tough to take down. Pretty much the standard multiple HP general's bodyguard unit that you'll find on foot. But now we shall move on to the archers and cavalry, which RHUN have a great deal more of than Khazad-dûm. So just looking at this site means we've got a bit more of an adventure ahead of us than we did with Khazad-dûm during this section, and we shall start off with the archers once again. Well, the ranged contingent, I should say, because RHUN certainly do have more than just their archers, but we'll start off with them nonetheless. And we'll start off with the RHUN hunters, which are certainly very reminiscent of how the orcs tend to approach a skirmish fight, with just sheer numbers and the volume you get downrange. Their stats are really nothing too special. Individually as well, they will easily be picked apart by more armoured archers as well, individually speaking. But of course, they won't be an individual because there are 203 of them under normal circumstances in each individual unit. So you just overwhelm with sheer numbers, and of course they are relatively cheap as well. 500 is, not a tiny amount of money, especially when you consider that the orcs can field archers for potentially less than that. But even so, this is sort of Sauron having an influence, I suppose, on the way the Easterlings do their warfare, and the RHUN hunters, of course, not a terrible idea to just go for a quantity approach in terms of skirmish fights. It has developed into a bit of a meta over the last couple of patches, and yeah, I mean the RHUN hunters, there's not really much else to say about them other than they are a quantity focused archer unit in the same mould as the orcs. Moving on, however, to some of RHUN's other skirmishers, because they are a faction with a lot of skirmish options, we have the Variag mercenaries. Now, the primary difference, of course, is they have less men in the unit, but they are individually a little bit stronger, so that means their missile attack is higher, but most noticeably their total defense is much higher, and that comes from the fact they have obviously slightly better armor, but they also have a shield. So this is something which is quite reminiscent of something like the Belagire archers, for example, and they can actually skirmish relatively well with other kingdoms of men, and it's certainly a unit which I've seen be quite popular for RHUN in the past, and I would imagine that's going to still be the case, purely because they're able to skirmish, and they're very easy to get cost effectiveness out of them. That's what I would say. And the Variag mercenaries have of course been a mainstay since vanilla, so it's good to see them still here. Obviously the Variags are from Khand, but obviously RHUN and Khand share in quite a lot of things, including the land that they inhabit for the most part. But yeah, the Variag mercenaries are certainly the defensive focused archer. But moving on to the offense focused archer, we have the Locate Narim, obviously another one of the golden boys over here, and they prioritise attack a little bit more. They do have a higher armor value, but generally speaking they will be a little bit better in terms of killing their foes rather than staying alive, which obviously does kind of decide for you what situation will be better. And I think that the Locate Narim are better when you're in a defensive siege, purely because of this, whereas I think the Variag mercenaries are going to be a safer bet in most other situations, to be honest with you. That doesn't mean the Locate Narim don't have their place, it just means they're quite specialised with regards to what they will be most cost effective at doing. But then as we move on to the final, runic composite bow unit, we have the Cardinal Shadow Bows, which are of course a ranger unit. So their missile attack is only 5, but the body piercing more than makes up for that. You can only have one ranger unit, of course, before the cost will start to dramatically increase. But the Cardinal Shadow Bows, obviously, you know my opinion on rangers. Rangers are 9 times out of 10 going to be worth it if you intend to play a little bit more defensively. They can hide anywhere, of course, so potentially you can get some very nice ambushes off, particularly if you have the right combination of units around them. So if you have, for example, some assassins or maybe some Cardinal Shadow Guard with them, and you save them for the late game in a free-for-all, for example, then the Cardinal Shadow Bows could potentially do a huge amount of damage, you know. And Rangers are what Rangers are, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm going to be saying the same thing throughout all of these faction showcases for every Ranger pretty much, because they do have slight stat differences, but ultimately they're going to be used for largely the same thing no matter which one they are. And the fact that RHUN have access to a Ranger, again, just plays into the fact that they have so many types of units available to them. Now though, moving back on over here to another type of skirmisher entirely, we of course have the runic crossbowman. Starting off here with the RHUN crossbowman, and over here we have the standard variety, and just next to them we have the variety that has the first level of armour upgrade, so they have this similar sort of appearance to the bronze level of RHUN clansmen. Obviously crossbows, they are an armour piercing missile, they don't have quite the same range as a composite bow unit of course, but they are, you know, crossbows for the most part can be used as a warding tool against heavily armoured infantry pushing in from the flanks and against cavalry, and if you get them into a good place in a siege, of course, they can lay waste to entire units very quickly. And the RHUN crossbows only cost 600, which is not an awful lot for a unit like this. Of course, their Achilles heel is the fact they can be skirmished down by enemy archers very easily, and unlike the Umbar Corsair crossbows, they don't have the ability to hide anywhere, so they're going to be out in the open from the beginning of the battle, and they are going to become a beacon for all of the enemy's archer fire, if you bring them, of course. Because RHUN are one of the factions that have crossbows that might not necessarily want to bring them in every situation, purely because they have so many other options they could use. But having said that, the RHUN crossbows are certainly a very cheap method of getting some very good close-range punch into the battle. However, it's not like RHUN are lacking in terms of crossbows at the higher tier either, because they have the fearsome Dragon's Wrath crossbows. Although I hesitate to call them crossbows, they're more of a sort of shotgun or an old, sort of ye old flamethrower in many ways. They combine the fact that they are incredibly damaging at range. They only have 2 volleys really, but that's going to be enough to wipe out an entire unit regardless of what it is. And they also become pretty strong units in melee, honestly, as well. They frighten nearby enemy infantry as well. Just look at those stats as well. Total defense of 24 with a defensive skill of 13. Now they don't have a shield value, so they could potentially be skirmished down, and they can't hide either. But particularly in a siege, both offensive and defensive, I can picture the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen being used to potentially lethal effect. But we shall see. They're definitely a very niche unit in many ways, because there are certain situations in which they will be next to useless. If they get shut down without being used, that's 1,300 florins down the drain after all. Moving back, however, into the final type of skirmisher that RHUN have available to them, and that is, of course, the javelins. We have the Balchoth Trison here, who can have an armour upgrade, but it looks as though it doesn't make any difference visually. And of course, this is just basic javelins. 650 is not a small amount of money for a unit which can potentially be so easily killed. I mean, in melee, they're not dreadful, but they're not really going to win any contests either. A cav charge, provided they don't get any return fire on the unit that is charging them, is also going to be enough to wipe them out pretty substantially. Having said that, of course, you know, javelins, they have lost some of the thrown attribute is something that they have lost, although that's something which kind of deserves going into a little bit more detail than I could possibly go into here. But suffice it to say that they won't do quite the same level of damage to things like Mumakil anymore. But having said that, of course, if you can get them into a good position, throwing down into enemy infantry lines, or using them as a warding tool against cavalry in a similar vein to the clan crossbows, of course, they can be very, very good indeed. But of course, you know, javelins are a little bit more, these are a little bit more tricky to use than crossbows, I would say. Crossbows, it's just a case of putting them into a good position and keeping the enemy cavalry away, whereas javelins require a little bit more of a proactive approach. There are factions with better javelins, but RHUN, of course, just the fact they have more of these types of units is good. And when it comes down to a single unit, the Balchoth Sapphire Bladesmen are one of the strongest in the game, and they do still have the throne attribute, I think. So they will still be able to skewer Mumakil incredibly quickly, and units of a similar type to them. So I think the Rhinos or the Muhad Beasts from Harad are also included in that. And they, of course, just like the Dragon's Wrath crossbows before them, are quite a capable melee fighter as well. They are not quite as strong as the Dragon's Wrath crossbows at staying alive anyway, but they look at that melee attack of 25. That is pretty substantial indeed. And of course, again, it's just going to be an acquired taste of whether you can utilise this unit to its full effectiveness, because again, just like the Dragon's Wrath crossbows, they can be shut down relatively easily, only 63 of them as well, and they have low armour values and shield values, so they can be skirmished down as well, even with those 2 hit points, so it is worthwhile being very careful indeed. Now though, we move on to the Runic Cavalry, and just like the other areas of their army, they have several options here as well. Starting off with the Eastron Clan Chiefs, which are a spear cavalry unit, which is kind of like a Lancer melee cav hybrid. They have a bonus versus cavalry and melee. They have a decent charge bonus as well of 10. It's kind of like being the, I won't say jack of all trades, master of none, because you could apply that to RHUN as a whole, although for reasons I'll go into at the end, I don't think that's entirely fair. But the Eastron Clan Chiefs, they're basically a general purpose cav unit that you can spend a relatively small amount of money on and still get a decent amount out of them overall. And I do believe that the Eastron Clan Chiefs are a worthwhile addition to any runic line. The downside, of course, is they have a relatively low armour value in addition to having a pretty woeful shield value as well. Well, it's a non-existent shield value in fact, so enemy archers, just basic low tier archers even, will be able to do substantial damage if you linger too long near the enemy skirmish line. They're definitely best off used as a method of saturating the enemy cav and bringing them down. So if you sort of flank your knights and your multiple HP lancers with your Eastron Clan Chiefs, you're going to have a pretty effective fighting force on horseback. Once again, there are factions which will be able to do this better, like Khand, but again, RHUN are able to at least contest this fight where most other factions would fall apart. Over here, we have the first Lancer unit that RHUN have available to them, and that is the Locate in Asrim. Of course, they have that armor-piercing charge, which is brutally nasty, charge bonus of 15. They're not multiple HP, and they don't have a shield, which is a potential stumbling block. They also cost 975, so this is a unit which I've heard a few conflicting reports about. Mainly, I think the sort of generally accepted view at the moment is that they're maybe a little bit overpriced. But having said that, Lancers, how much you get out of them from a battle-to-battle basis is going to vary wildly, because they will either manage to kill several units with their charges, or they will fizzle out before they're really capable of doing much of anything. That's kind of the fate of most single HP Lancers. One of the things that Inasrim certainly have in their favour is the fact they might not have a shield, but they do have pretty substantial armour values. So if they come up against another Lancer in combat particularly, the fact that they won't be taking any armour-piercing damage means that their armour should mean they should beat most other single HP Lancer units in melee. So that is something to be worth considering, that they are more nasty in melee perhaps than other cavalry, because they will be able to stand up to a little bit more punishment. Of course, that does fall apart when you consider that there are armour-piercing cavalry, and of course melee cavalry will eat them for breakfast for the most part, like most other single HP Lancers. And then we have the multiple HP variant over here, the Dragon's Wrath Warlords, which of course do have a shield, a substantial shield bonus of 8 as well. Better stats across the board generally, the same charge bonus interestingly enough, and slightly less men in the unit at 33 as opposed to 58. But of course the main selling point is the fact they have 2 HP, which makes them significantly stronger, so they'll be able to take a lot more punishment. A little bit of a safer place for your general to be. 1200 florins as well might be worthwhile bringing, particularly if you feel as though the enemy are not going to be able to contest the cav game quite so much. I think the Dragon's Wrath Warlords will be quite a good choice. However, if you feel as though your general is going to be accosted on horseback, then you really need look no further than the Carmel's Dragon Knights, which are of course the runic knight unit. They're essentially the same as the multiple HP Lancers, only they have better stats across the board, including a lethal charge bonus of 20, which is as high as standard horse units go. I know there are some units with a higher charge bonus, but they tend to be special units, which we'll get onto in a moment. But essentially they also have a bonus against cavalry and melee, so the knights are still a real tour de force in melee. Well, across all the battlefield really, but you do pay for them. 1500 florins is a pretty large investment. 9 times out of 10 though, on an open field, I think I would still be tempted to bring the Dragon Knights over something like the Dragon's Wrath Warlords or the Carmel's Chosen, particularly the Carmel's Chosen though. I feel as though they're certainly a siege focused unit. You could bring both, You could bring both of these units to have a real cavalry presence, but that is a bit of a risk, particularly if you're up against a faction which can really contest that. I would recommend against doing such things if you're up against Khand, RHUN or Dol Amroth, for example, or any of the Orc factions with their wargs, but you do have other tools to deal with that. But against other kingdoms of men that are not quite so cavalry focused, something like the Dragon Knights and the Dragon's Wrath Warlords can be potentially extremely deadly. Dragon Knights also look absolutely fantastic. I do like the Carmel's units. As we sort of scoot across the battlefield over here, we'll have a look at the 1 horse arch unit. Again, this is another unit which can be outclassed by horse archers from other factions, but the fact is, again, RHUN is still able to field a unit in this category. The Variag Mercenary Riders, of course, they won't win any contests in terms of individual horse archer units, but they will still offer a great deal of mobility, speed, and harassment, which RHUN can utilise to their advantage quite well. It does mean that, of course, you won't be static on the battlefield. You know, they do offer you the ability to spray down particularly lightly armoured factions against the likes of the elves. While they may take a huge amount of damage from the enemy archers, they should still be able to do some damage in return. And they do have that shield value, of course, of 5, which is not a bad thing. I mean, some horse archers don't have a shield at all, so interesting to see how they develop in terms of a meta. But RHUN, of course, are all about their versatility, and this horse archer just adds to that. And then finally, we have one of the special units, one of the 2 chariot units in the game. We have the Runic War Chariots. They have a charge bonus of 24, of course, so slightly more. But again, chariots, their problem has always been that they are very much a situational unit. They're a big risk to take most of the time, because as soon as they start getting bogged down, even though they have 4 hit points, they will fall away relatively quickly. Having said that, if you can get them running along the enemy infantry line, they could break it all and win the battle all on their own. So again, there's nothing much really else to say about the Runic War Chariots, or the Linden Chariots indeed. If there's ever a replay where I can sort of show them in their full glory, then maybe, you know, more context can be added to this. But as it is, the Chariots are always going to be a pretty big risk, particularly seeing as they do cost quite a lot of 1200. And with that, that wraps up the Runic roster. So to offer my thoughts on RHUN, what do I think? Well, I did say they were a jack of all trades, and I do stand by that. I mean, you just have to look at the options they have. They have good lower tier units with a lot of numbers that they can use as a quantity over quality approach, both in foot-based melee units and archers, and to a lesser extent their cavalry with something like these Eastron clan chiefs, because 600 is not a huge amount to spend on a cavalry unit which has a bonus against other cavalry in melee, and has a decent charge as well. I mean, the mercenary cavalry are, I think, 600 florins as well across the board, but they don't have quite the same utility that the Eastron clan chiefs have potentially. They also have a horse archer unit. They have some really nice high tier cavalry in the Dragon Knights and the Dragon's Wrath Warlords. They have a very solid central infantry line with all of these Loke units. Decent sort of mainline archers as well with the Narum and the Variag Mercenaries. Crossbows are always a nice addition because they really help against cavalry in an open field in particular, and in a siege, if they get in the right position, they can really lay an enemy army low. Javelins as well, both basic and high tier. And then there's also the sort of more gimmicky units in many ways in the Dragon's Wrath Crossbowmen and the Runic War Chariots. The criticism I hear of RHUN is that they're a jack of all trades, master of none. To an extent this is true. I mean, in the past RHUN have sort of spiked in being a little bit OP. I don't think that's the case anymore, but I do feel as though if I were to recommend a completely new player coming in and trying to learn the game, RHUN would be the faction I send them to first. Now, there are factions which it's easier to win with at the moment, like in particular in the current meta. This is pre the mini hotfix which is coming out. Something like Harad or even the Misty Mountains would probably be easier to get wins with on a regular basis. And there are also factions which it's easier to learn how to play. Angmar, for example, with their very heavy rush focus, it's very easy to sort of get acquainted with their units and sort of fall into tactics that are comfortable for you. But if I were to sort of point a new player in the direction of a faction which can do a little bit of everything and do it well, which is another sort of factor I would say, because any faction can potentially do everything, but few do it as well as RHUN can here, and it really teaches players every aspect of the game in many ways, and that's why I do quite like RHUN, because of their versatility. The one area in which I would say they do have a bit of specialisation, however, is in their armour piercing capabilities in melee and at range. A lot of their units have got this armour piercing, whether it's the Dragon's Wrath Guildsman's projectile attacks, whether it's the Loka Gamprim and the Loke Flagrim in the main infantry line, the Carmel Shadow Guarders, the shock infantry which can come in from the side, the javelins and the crossbows which work at range, and the extensive level of lancers that they have which produce that armour piercing charge, of course. This can make them a real pain to deal with, particularly if you're someone like the dwarves who can't really exert too much of a ranged advantage over RHUN because they have all the same tools, only potentially more cost effective, and in melee they can really make their presence felt. Now this is of course a double-edged sword, because while it will work against factions like human factions which are good, you know, which rely on their armour, stuff like Gondor for example, or Cardolan and the dwarves, that will set you back a little bit against factions which don't do that, such as all of the elves except Imladris, and certain human factions like Rudauer or potentially even Rohan. So yeah, I mean, it all depends really on what you want, but I would say that if you're unsure of who you want to play in a game, go for RHUN, because they can pretty much do everything, and they can do everything well, and you can build an army based on pretty much any situation you want, because you can beat the elves with RHUN as well. It just depends on what you want to bring. So yeah, that pretty much wraps up RHUN. Again, let me know what you think of this new format as it continues, and the next faction we'll take a look at is going to be Isengard.